Brian Grazer is an Academy Award-winning producer, a New York Times best-selling author, and he's been one of Hollywood's biggest power players for more than a quarter century. Films like Apollo 13, American Gangster, and A Beautiful Mind are examples of the diverse and important subjects that he's tackled. His latest creation is the book, A Curious Mind, The Secret to a Bigger Life, which provides readers with an inside look at Grazer's curiosity conversations. These are informal discussions, many of which are actually with strangers, that fuel his creativity and inspire his greatest work. So just how does curiosity lead to real insight and great discovery? Well, Brian joins us now to feed our curiosity. Welcome to Full Frame.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
There's power of curiosity and conversation. I mean, I love this job because I get a chance to sit down with people like you and kind of pick your brain, get inside your head. But what's weird in what people don't recognize about talk shows is we sit down, boom, you've got to create a connection. And here you are, you're putting this thing together. It's almost the same sort of thing. Do you go in anticipating something? Do you go in with an agenda? I mean, how do you approach it?
Okay, well, great question. Fantastic question. What I often do is I come with the gift of some information, a declarative sentence that has value to that person. So I might say to you, oh, I might have thought of who's the greatest talk show host that you would personally admire, because I do a little homework. And then I'd say, oh my God, I met him. I met Bill Moyers. I just mentioned to you I met Bill Moyers. You said I really was impressed with Bill Moyers. So I bring to you something that has value to you, that makes you feel as though I've researched you, that I care. Caring equals trust. And then if it's information, then you find that interesting. And so I try to start that way.
So I want to go back in time because I loved your book. And what I loved about your book is, and I mentioned this to you also in the hallway, it's not just about curiosity and it's not just about conversation. A big piece of it is courage, which started early on. You overhear somebody talking about this great job. You get that job and it's delivering documents. And it's an easy job.
Right.
It's just dump off the documents.
It's a clerical job. We're just supposed to drop the papers off to a secretary or receptionist.
But you had the guts to take it one step further. Tell our audience.
So basically what I did is I got, just out of college, I got a job as a law clerk. It could have been a clerk to anything. It just happened to be a law clerk at Warner Brothers. I didn't know anything about entertainment, which might seem hard to believe given that my whole life has been about entertainment, movies and television, and as recent as Empire. But I wanted to meet the real people. I didn't want to just drop it off to a secretary or an assistant or I'll meet you out in the parking lot, well, bring it up to see Warren Beatty. I said, the only way Warren Beatty can have this piece of paper, the only way it's valid is if I can hand it to him directly. And the person that I said it to accepted that. So soon enough, I was in Warren Beatty's living room at the Beverly Wilshire Hotels where he was living and was having a real conversation with him. And I did that with the writer of the novel The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty. I did it with Francis Ford Coppola. I did it with so many people because for Warner Brothers, you had to drop off papers and or transfer them. And I just said, oh, the only way that it's valid to this, the most famous agent in the world at the time was Sue Mingers, is I have to hand it to her directly. She represented Barbra Streisand and Ryan O'Neal and Steve McQueen, and I just wanted to know about what woman has that kind of power to do that, and what is she like? What's her personality like? And I somehow got into her office and got a feeling of what that was all about.
And you tell this great story about the leadership. You end up in this cozy office where you're right up there with all the big bosses, and one of them just throws a notepad at you and says, you know, put it here. You got to have ideas. You got to be creative. You learned a lot with these conversations, didn't you?
I learned a lot through these conversations. What I did is I had this tiny little sliver of an office. I asked my boss, who had started with Jack Warner, can I have this big office, in fact, a bigger office than his, but it was perfect access to the chairman of the board of Warner Brothers and the president, Frank Wells. So he said, sure, go take that office. So all of a sudden I had this huge office that had immediate access to the cadre of offices of all the senior management. And one of them just said, if you want to understand our business, it's all about leverage. Leverage is created through IP, like ideas, right ideas. And they said, here's a number 2 pencil, here's a piece of paper, put the pencil to the paper and it has greater value than it did as separate parts. Now get out of here. And that's sort of how it started, with Lou Wasserman saying that to me.
Best advice you ever got?
It was the best advice I ever got.
Let me pick up a quote from the book, and I want you to expand on this. Unlike creativity and innovation, curiosity is by its nature more accessible, more democratic, easier to see, and also easier to do. You're really putting it up there. And one of the other things that you point out is in school, you may, become an entrepreneur, do this and that, but curiosity never really gets the top billing that you think it deserves.
Well, yeah, because curiosity has always been thought of as a word that implies inferiority, because it's pretty much stating that you don't know the answers. I have a question, I have my hand in the air. Everyone is often expected to know the answers or to know how to get the answers. By asking questions, initiating a question, it's a disclaimer. It's saying, I don't know the answers. And in one point in time in American education, it was pretty much saying, I'm stupid. I'm stupid, I don't know the answers, I'm a fool. And that is now changing form. But I think curiosity is pure, it is completely a democratic force because there's no prejudice involved in curiosity. It's not legislated really in any way. You just ask, you feel liberated enough to ask the questions that matter. As long as you're polite, you're doing it. And so with curiosity, what that does is that leads to potentially inspiration. And if you feel inspired, that's where real breakthroughs come from. So the breakthroughs that we read about from the people that started our country or that live in history all really come from a point in time that they're inspired and they recognize something that is needed and have an answer to it.
It almost seems inherent if you're in a certain position to have all the answers. I've got all the answers. And here you are, a guy who's saying, look, having the questions is more important than having all the answers, and getting at those answers is really kind of a nice journey.
It is. I think it is a really nice journey. Ron Howard and I have had a partnership for over 30 years, and there's one time I know I specifically didn't like his musical score in a movie. And he said, what do you think? And I said, I'm not sure. What do you think? And he knew that meant I didn't like it. But it didn't degrade him. It didn't put him down. It lacks sort of a judgmental quality. And then it causes the sensitive, smart people to rethink their conclusions.
You sit down with all these different people, and I'm sure, like I interview a lot of people, and there's certain interviews, I'm really looking forward to talking to that person. They're fascinating, and I want to ask them this or that. There has to be this build-up before you go into these. And then sometimes there's a huge letdown. I mean, it's like a blind date in a sense. Sometimes you hit it off, sometimes you don't. I mean, are there extreme disappointments and extreme highs? And
that's so brilliant. Yes, there are. As you said, you prepare, you create, there's some anticipation involved, and you have a preconception of what's going to happen. I've learned that almost every one of my preconceptions has been wrong. That I've met with a very famous chef, probably at one time I met with a great chef that was very interesting and entertaining, and but I met with recently a chef within the last 2 years that I thought this would be amazing, and it was one of the dullest experiences I had. But I thought it would be unbelievable. I have a great story with Rem Koolhaas, one of the greatest living architects. I didn't want to meet with architects because I thought, there's kind of an antiseptic quality about architects. I created a prejudice against architects. I thought there's a lack of humanity. It's a sort of a sterile. It's manipulating shapes and form. The first thing he said to me was, I look at architecture as a living organism. I couldn't have been more wrong, and it completely captivated me. And it was one of the better meetings I'd ever had.
They kind of go from extreme to extreme in a sense, correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Some can be grumpy.
Some can be grumpy. I mean, Edward Teller was a pretty grumpy guy. I mean, he was the father of the hydrogen bomb. He then, at the time that I finally was able to meet with him, it took about 2 years for him to say yes. He was creating the Star Wars program that was supposed to save the North American continent, that would throw satellites out into the sky and deflect anything that could be of danger to Americans. And so I met with him, and he was really crabby. He just seemed to have like he hadn't seen a movie in 50 years. He said.
Oh my gosh.
He's happy to say that. He just wasn't interested in any kind of narrative storytelling or just humanities themselves. He was kind of a technocrat. But look, I always find the silver lining. Look, the guy was a brilliant man, and in fathering the hydrogen bomb, I mean, he could have, I don't know his motivation. I mean, it could have been a reaction to what was going on in the world in our country at that time, or it could have been malevolent. I don't know the answer. I don't presume to know the answer. With Isaac Asimov, who is the most prolific writer of science fiction, basically I flew from LA to New York to meet with him, and he sat there with his wife, and within a minute the two of them said, "We're leaving." And I said, "Well, how could you leave?" And they said, "Well, it's evident that you don't know enough about Isaac's work and you don't know enough about robotics." And they just left. And now that sounds pretty tough. And look, they could have done it. There's a more human way of doing it, but it taught me to do more homework, better homework.
Wow.
That I shouldn't have made that request and been so committed to that request without really knowing more about his body of work.
Let me talk to you about creativity, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. The industry, I mean, it's terrible that Teller didn't go see movies for 50 years, but recently, I think you could kind of take a pass on some of these movies. They all seem to be the same, prequels, sequels. As a curious, creative guy, how frustrating is that for you?
Well, it's interesting. It's not frustrating in the way you say it, because what you learn from curiosity conversations is you learn that everyone has a different entry point into their story. So that means perspective. So what is the perspective in which the story is told? For example, when I produced A Beautiful Mind, there were other movies that were about schizophrenia, but they were an objective look at schizophrenia. What I was able to do, or Ron and I were able to do with Russell Crowe and Akiva Goldsman, we were able to shift the perspective and make it a subjective look at schizophrenia. So the story started in an alternate reality. So those things happen. I think what you're referring to is there's lots of sequels now, but there are lots of sequels. Some of the sequels are good, and some of the sequels are pretty repetitive. I mean, the part that I think you're even more deeply referring to is if you're doing a sequel, by nature of that, you're covering the same subject. So the good sequels are covering the same subject through a different perspective.
I'm sure you must go to dinner parties, and people know your history and stuff. What do you find are the interesting questions people ask about your curiosity conversations? I mean, everybody must ask you, oh, who's the most interesting?
Yeah.
Who's the funniest? Who's the weirdest? But I'm curious, have you ever had a question at like a dinner party about these conversations that may have been different?
Often, like, people will say, they've never asked, like, has anyone caused you personal pain? Edward Teller or Isaac Asimov, that wasn't really personal pain. I mean, has anyone reached me on some profound level, either positively or negatively? Negatively usually has the most lasting impact. Although Jonas Salk was so positive, and he had so questions like that, usually people do say who you want to meet next and why. They like to know why I would want to meet somebody.
And the answer always is, it's a spark inside you.
Yeah, it's just I want to know what's going on in their mind, what's living in their psyche,
I have to ask you about the pictures you leave behind in people's houses.
Okay, yeah.
So what is this all about?
I'm a guy with a lot of funny little disciplines, including the one of curiosity, but I do have these, for 20 years, I bring pictures of myself in a very kitschy, like a $1 heart frame that I get at the CVS. So it's a heart frame picture with me in kind of a kitschy like that, and I hide it in people's houses.
I'm curious how that came about.
I did it kind of accidentally as a joke to some. His name was Marvin Davis. He was part owner in 20th Century Fox. He was an oil wildcatter, and I got invited to this big party, and I just somehow brought this picture and left it at his house, and I left it amongst all of the other pictures on his piano, these famous presidents and dignitaries, family members, and he got very mad about it, like really mad. And then I thought, wow, it's so polarizing. I should continue doing this.
Oh my God, that's your next book, isn't it?
And so, you know, often I do it with people that they get a big kick out of it and they leave it there. I left one at George Clooney's. I just, last weekend at a barbecue for Naomi Campbell, I left one at her place. Most people like it. Often people don't find it for at least a year because I buried it within the other photographs.
We'll leave it there.
Okay.
Great conversation.
Hey.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.